I was ordained a priest the weekend we celebrated Trinity Sunday. Every priest I talked to about my first Mass asked me, "Are you going to preach at your first Mass?" And when I told them I was and what weekend the Mass fell on, they all responded the same: good luck. Preaching on the Blessed Trinity is not the easiest thing to do, but I would rather give that homily again over this weekend's gospel any day of the week. Is it just me, or is Jesus commending this steward for some shady accounting? The steward in our story was caught not doing his job by the master, and so the master tells him to pack up and go home. Our steward is now in crisis mode because he likes his desk job and doesn't want to do physical labor. He needs to save his own rear end. And so he calls on the people who owe the master and tells them to pay at least half of what they owe, so that when he's thrown out of his job, these people will like him and maybe give him some work that's not physical labor. But when the master finds out what the steward did, he's actually pleased and lets him keep his job. This is what Jesus wants us to do. Context is everything. Jesus can't contradict himself because he's God, and God can't contradict himself because he's perfect. So we need to call to mind other parables or teachings of Jesus. For example, let's recall the parable of the unforgiving servant in the Gospel of Matthew. Now the servant owed his master money and could not pay it, but the master forgave the debt until that servant demanded a fellow colleague to pay him his money. And when the master found out that he would not show the same mercy, he was thrown into jail. And so see, that's clearly wrong. But how is being sneaky better? Well, sometimes it's better not to pay attention to the very fine details of the story and just look at the story. Our steward was going to lose his job for not collecting what belonged to the master. What would have been another way that he could have saved his job? Well, he could have demanded that the people pay their debt in full plus interest at the threat of losing their lives. And by the steward doing this, the master would have been made more rich because of this steward. But the steward didn't do that. He knew that would be wrong. So he had mercy on the people who owed the master. The steward knew that he screwed up, and he didn't want to be punished. However, he also knew it wasn't the fault of these people. So the steward met them halfway. The master saw this prudent and merciful act and became merciful toward him in return, even though the motives were not quite there. Okay, so what does this mean for us today? The obvious answer is to be merciful and prudent. But I think a bigger question the gospel is asking us to ponder today is, how will I react in a spiritual crisis? This steward was in crisis mode with his master. He was caught not doing his job, and he had to act fast to stay in the master's good graces and keep his job, and he succeeded. So how will we react when we find ourselves in a spiritual crisis? When we realize that we have been committing the same sin over and over and over again? When the lies that we've been telling ourselves catch up with us? When we find ourselves alone because we have hurt too many people? When we realize that the things and possessions we have aren't making us happy, but rather miserable, how will we respond? The right response is to run, don't walk, to the sacraments, especially the sacrament of reconciliation if the problem is rooted in sinful behavior. Then, once you have experienced God's healing words in that beautiful sacrament, which we offer here every Saturday at 5:45, and any time that you see any of us priests on campus, please stop us and ask. We will certainly hear your confession. But once you receive that healing grace, then run again. Don't walk, run to the Eucharist, the true wellspring of salvation and medicinal nourishment for our souls. Let's all work together and with each other on being prudent and merciful, so that when we experience our own spiritual crisis, we will know that we have the support of our families, friends, and most certainly of our parish community of faith. We can't do any of this alone. We need the sacraments to nourish us and sustain us in the true foundation, who is Jesus Christ.